Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We have looks like 12 people on the line, and typically some more people hop on as we get going. So I'm just going to go ahead and get us started today. Our agenda, we've got a great agenda. We have a presentation from Carlton Lane about invasive species and the EPA. And then we're going to get an update from the Apalachicola Regional Stewardship Alliance, CISMA. And then we have some shout outs, and I've got a few reminders for folks before we adjourn. And I just wanted to let folks know too, you may have noticed, and I'll address this at the end as well, that our topics for the calls are shifting a little from our original schedule. Our last 3 topics were scheduled very far out in advance, so we're just having to move some things around. So appreciate your flexibility. And so just keep an eye, as you know, when I send out the reminder emails on what the topic for the call may shift, but I think we've got it mostly worked out now. So we've got a few more people hopping on, and without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get us started with Dr. Lane's presentation, and I will hand the mouse over to you.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Carlton Lane. I'm the Executive Director of the Aquatic Ecosystem Restoration Foundation. In a previous life, I worked for 30 years with the Environmental Protection Agency in various capacities in the pesticides area. Before that, I was with USDA for 5 years. So I'm an old Fed, and this organization is new to me. So if I'm covering territory that you're already well versed in, please shout out and I'll make something else up. So without any further ado, I'll get going here. Whoop. So an alternate name would be where reason and regulations intersect, because sometimes the EPA, through the statute that they administer, almost make life hard for you land managers and water resource managers. But the key thing that EPA is involved in that would affect what you do is the FIFRA, and that's the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act as amended. And it's also known under another name as the Federal Pesticide Control Act. That's an old moniker, but it's applicable. Essentially what it does is the purpose of it is to register pesticides prior to them entering the channels of trade. As part of that, I mean, you can hear various estimates of what it costs, but it's suffice to say it's a very expensive proposition, and it takes time. Assuming everything is lined up just right, there's about 120 different studies that's a minimum that have to be submitted to EPA right up front. So if a company doesn't have everything they need, then they might as well just wait, because EPA will kick it back. If it's a water herbicide or insecticide that involves water, bump that up to about 150 different studies. At the end of the day, it's a risk-benefit statute, and EPA kind of looks at FIFRA as the black sheep of the agency, because all the other statutes are about keeping, quote, pollutants, unquote, out of the environment. The pesticide program is actually involved in essentially licensing these chemicals to be introduced into the environment. So what makes it even weirder is all the other environmental statutes that EPA administers is strictly risk-based. That's what drives everything from hazardous waste to RCRA to Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. Everything is risk-oriented. By law, the pesticide law requires EPA to consider both the risks and the benefits of the intended use of the pesticide, and make a determination at that point. So the standard that's used, that is constantly referred to by agency personnel for good reason, the standard is no pesticide will be registered unless the registrant has shown to a reasonable certainty that there will be no unreasonable adverse effects to human health or the environment. So they take that standard has to be met first, and then they look at the risk and the benefit. And the benefits can be as simple as an economic. It's good economics. It will enhance the water resource. It'll prevent invasive species, let's say, in the case of an aquatic herbicide or a terrestrial herbicide. And that all will be examined through about a 2-year process. From beginning to end, the agency has a program called PREA, where a company will pay a fee, and within a certain specified amount of time, the agency will have to respond. So for a new registration, assuming everything's in place, as far as the number of statutes, it'll take about 2 years. So everything, once the product is registered, all the directions for use, most of the safety requirements, and the ultimate end use of the product will be site or crop oriented. So when I'm talking site, talking things like quiescent or still water, flowing water, it could be ditch bank, canal banks, riparian areas, lake shores, upland areas, natural areas. All those different things would be considered sites. And many of the, I would even say most of the data that are required for registration are oriented toward that site or crop. You'll find quite a bit of variation depending on where the product is intended to be used. So, lastly, on this slide is the uses themselves are highly regulated. So once a product is registered for use, there's a provision that kicks in that says it shall be unlawful for any person to use any registered pesticide in a manner inconsistent with the label. So what that does is the expression that's used for any of you who are certified applicators, I know you've heard it, is the label is the law. And that means that an agent, either of the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services or EPA itself, is investigating maybe a human health poisoning or an environmental complaint, fish kill, bird kill, something killed that wasn't intended to be killed, drift, any of those sorts of things. If they find that the product's direction for use were not followed, then whoever used the product is subject to prosecution under state and or federal law. So that's, in a nutshell, the registration process, and then what happens after the product is registered. Now, here's where you get some break if you're aware of these types of registrations. In the event you're in the business of taking care of invasive species, either in water or in upland situations. As I said, everything is site or crop oriented. So we'll think about sites. So the section 3 is section 3 of FIFRA. That's the part of the law that deals with registration. And when a company is issued a section 3 registration, it's basically a full label. So you go into Lowe's or Home Depot and you go to the pesticide section, you see all those Bayer products and Roundup and whatever else you're looking at. Those are Section 3 registrations. You buy the product, everything you need to use the product legally is on the label. It's got all the EPA accepted label requirements are there. Now within FIFRA, there's a provision called 2EE. Section 2 is the definition section of the law, and EE would be in that definition section. EE has to do with use inconsistent with the label. And there are some exceptions there that you may find beneficial with your work. First of all, you can use a product for an unnamed target pest. So on the label, the company is going to take responsibility for the use of their product to control any of the pests that are listed on the label. So if you use their product on, say, Brazilian pepper, and it doesn't work, and Brazilian pepper is on the label, you can go to the company and tell them that, and they will make it right. But sometimes a chemical will work on a pest, and you'll find the pest is not on the label. Maybe because it's a new invasive species, there aren't any data generated yet that would allow the company to put it on the label. Whatever, you can make up all sorts of scenarios where that would fit. The EPA says that as long as the site is on the label, you may use that product legally to control any pest. So say, for example, we have ditch banks or canal banks, and you want to use that product to control Brazilian pepper. Or you find a new infestation of Lygodium, and it's in a wetland, and that particular location is on the label, but Lygodium is not. It's legal for you to use that product to control that pest, as long as the site is on the label, you don't exceed maximum rates that are listed, and you follow all the other environmental precautions and personal protective equipment requirements. So that's a gimme. The second thing that's listed in 2EE is you may use mixes. You may use pesticides mixed together. You may use pesticides and fertilizers if you have reason to do that. You may use pesticides and surfactants and adjuvants and spreader stickers and penetrating agents and anything else, any kind of adjuvant you could think of can be used in a tank mix as long as it's not prohibited by the directions for use on the label. Excuse me. So that's number 2. The third is you may use less than the label rate if you think that's adequate. That's not a misuse. You can use less. You could use, say, 2/3 of the rate. Instead of 3 quarts to a gallon, you can use 2 quarts to a gallon, and that's not illegal. There are risks associated with that, however. The risk is it may not work as well if you're not using the maximum rate. And also if you're, it could be enhancing resistance. If you consistently use low rates to control a pest, then resistance starts to become a concern. You'll find that directions for use for things like mosquito control, adult mosquitoes, larvicides, disinfectants, termiticides, those particular products are more likely than not to have a provision on the label that says do not use less than the recommended label rates, in which case that would take precedence over 2EE. Also, the fourth thing that's in 2EE is you can use any method of application that you want to, as long as it's not prohibited by the label, either expressly prohibited or implied. You know, when I'm doing training, an example I use is an aerial applicator used a granular nematicide, let's say, over the top, sprayed it, and um, it was investigated. And the directions for use said something like, apply in a band application with directed spray toward the base of the plant. Well, obviously, you can't do that from an airplane going 140 miles an hour, 10 feet off the ground. That's an implied prohibition. You have to use the specific directions for use that are on the label. So those are 4 gimmies, if you will, that's in the statute in FIFRA. You also pick up some help under Section 24C. That's Section 24 of FIFRA. And that provides for state registrations for special local needs. Now, the product has to be a registered pesticide already. And if it's to be used on a crop, then it has to have tolerances already established by Food and Drug. But it presents a wonderful way for this rapid response. You know, in my experience, early detection occurs a lot. Rapid response is not something you see very often. If you're measuring your rapid response in months or years, then it's not rapid. 24C offers that opportunity on a state level. It's state by state. It's not a national amendment to the label. It's strictly a special local need that would be issued by the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. But the companies don't have to apply for it. It can be applied for by anyone. It's not unusual at all in Florida for the Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association to apply for 24Cs for their constituents. And it could be done either by a state agency or a consumer group or something like that that's doing invasive species management. So, oh, I spelled special wrong, or did I? Is that spelled right? Anyways, if it's spelled, it just looks weird, doesn't it? So special local need. That's special local need. You apply to the Department of Agriculture, and they'll walk you through any kind of additional thing. EPA then has 90 days either to accept or deny that application. But it can be done pretty quickly. You don't have to wait that 90 days. That's just how long EPA has. EPA and Florida Department of Agriculture also have the authority to issue experimental use permits. So this would be for a use that's not on the label, or it could even be a compound that's not even registered yet, but it's getting close, in which case you all may know about the product, you know about its potential. You have to work with a company on this, but you can get an experimental use permit at either the state or the federal level. The state area that can be used, the acreage, is reduced quite a bit for the state EUP, but it's still there. Often when you find a pioneer infestation of an invasive species, it's going to be fairly small anyway, so it's a possibility there. The best option for you at all is the emergency exemption. The emergency exemption is tailor-made for an early detection rapid response program. You have a product and it doesn't have to be registered, or it can be a use that's not on the label, and this is immediate. You don't have to wait to submit forms and get approval, all that sort of thing. This can be immediate. The application is, essentially it's the notification, is made by the Commissioner of Agriculture to EPA. A declaration of an emergency has to be made. There are different types. There's a public health emergency, there's special emergency, which is most of them are that, and there are a couple other ones as well, but it pretty much covers the gamut of what one may encounter in the field which might create the need for a product that is not registered for a particular use, but it will answer that emergency. I'd like to see more commissioners and more secretaries of agriculture around the country use this. That would help an awful lot to stop these pioneer infestations of invasives. So let me see where we are here. The other statute where this could impact you is the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act has the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System program, commonly known as NPDES. Over time, back in the 1970s, so 1972, when FIFRA was first amended under the Pesticide Control Act, and the Clean Water Act was passed about a month following that, there was no integration of those two programs. Pesticide use was not considered to be regulated by the Clean Water Act unless there was an application in, near, or over waters of the U.S. that was improper. If there was a misuse, then the applicator could be in violation of both FIFRA and the Clean Water Act. But traditionally, that was not, they weren't together. They were two separate things. One regulated pesticides and pesticide use, the other regulated discharges into waters of the U.S. A circuit court decision back in around 2006 changed that, and that judicial decision thus made any pesticide use in, near, or over waters of the U.S. subject to NPDES permitting. So that then brought up a huge controversy that rages still today, that's double regulation, it's unnecessary. It just depends on which side of the fence you're on, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. At the current time, there are bills. There was a House bill that has passed, a Senate bill. Both the House bill and the Senate bill are in a Senate Environment and Public Works Committee headed by Senator Barrasco from Wyoming. Both those bills are sitting there. They have not come up for a vote. If they do, the president has indicated he would sign it if it passed. Those bills would eliminate the NPDES requirement for pesticide applications in, near, or over waters of the U.S. There is a rider on draft farm bill that also would do the same thing. So, I mean, it's kind of a catch-22 there. Senator Barrasco doesn't want to do anything if it's going to go through on the farm bill anyways, and that's where it's just kind of hanging. So you no doubt have heard about waters of the U.S. That rule is now totally mucked up. It was rescinded by the Corps of Engineers and EPA, and then it's being rewritten. And in the meantime, EPA and the Corps had promulgated a rule that said that the definition of waters of the U.S. that existed prior to April 21st, 2014 was actually what they would be using. So there was another lawsuit that challenged that decision, and as a result of that, the old rule is still in effect in about 30 jurisdictions, and the new rule is in effect in about 20 jurisdictions. It's totally confusing as heck. My guess is the way that'll work out is EPA will use its prosecutorial discretion and not prosecute any pesticide cases under WOTUS and NPDES until all the legalities are worked out. Bottom line, I think within the next 6 months, you will likely see a draft Waters of the U.S. rule that EPA is trying and the Corps of Engineers are trying to get through. and that'll be open for comment, and they want your comments right away. So what Waters of the U.S. is that defines the point where federal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction in water meet. So the old rule was pretty straightforward. It was related to navigable waters. That goes all the way back to the 1899 Rivers and Harbors Act that originally defined navigable waters. The rule that was finalized in 2015 substantially expanded the federal jurisdiction. So many states were part of the litigation that sued EPA that they were overreaching their jurisdiction. And so that's where we are on WOTUS, and I'm going to end on endangered species. That's another place where pesticide regulation is acting with another federal statute, the Endangered Species Act, and all kinds of problems are there. The implementation of this can definitely affect what you're doing where invasive species are detected and there are endangered or threatened species near or there or their habitat. So the way it works basically, hopefully EPA, Interior, and Commerce, all of those have something to do with endangered species. Interior is Fish and Wildlife Service that deal with everything in freshwater or on land. Department of Commerce regulates marine areas and those fisheries where the fish actually go to sea. So we're talking about salmon and that sort of thing. So Interior Commerce, and then EPA registers the pesticides that would be used as we would like to see them used on invasive species and nuisance species. So under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, if a federal agency has any activity that could adversely impact endangered or threatened species or their habitat, then they must consult with either of the services to be sure that activity can be mitigated. That's what's happening right now, is they're looking at all of the pesticides that EPA registers and trying to determine whether or not it may affect. May affect is the threshold. So let's say there's an endangered plant and you're looking at herbicides. Is there the possibility that the herbicide may affect an endangered plant? Pretty likely, unless it's very selective. So that may affect then goes to the services. They issue a biological opinion after sometimes years, and then EPA is supposed to take that in biological opinion and create a way to mitigate the possible impact on endangered or threatened species or their habitat by modifying the label, sometimes reducing or eliminating uses. So that's endangered species. That's all the different ways that EPA under the pesticide law can impact invasive species and even nuisance species management. There are some tools there that can help you, and there are things that can get you in trouble if you're not following the directions for use properly, or if you're using products in water, if you're not covered by either an exemption or an NPDES permit that already exists, that could be problematic. So if you have any questions or anything, I'd be more than happy to try to make up an answer for you. And in the future, if you have anything, my contact information is right there. You may feel free to contact me at your leisure.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, we certainly have a few minutes to take some questions. So if anybody has a question, everyone is muted. So if you do want to ask a question, just make sure you unmute yourself so we can hear you.
Hey, Carlton, my name is Brian. I'm going to be speaking in a minute here about our CISMA up here in the Panhandle, but I just had a question. I know this is a little bit of a sort of tangential issue, but there's just been a lot of talk and news about glyphosate, and I'm just wondering from your professional opinion and all of your knowledge about labels and registry and stuff like that, if that concerns you or if that's changed your opinion, or if if you can just shed some light. There's just been a lot of sort of
Sure.
popular media, which I don't totally trust, and I know that the analysis probably isn't any different than it was 20 years ago.
No, the analysis is a little different, and it took me a while to figure out that the internet is not peer reviewed, so I can sympathize with you. What happened, as most of you probably know, is a group under the World Health Organization, IRAC, and bless my heart, I can't remember what that acronym what it stands for. They came out, that group, IRAC, came out with a finding that glyphosate was a probable carcinogen. So as soon as I heard that, I called Dan Kinney, who is the herbicide branch manager for EPA in the registration division. And I said, Dan, how is this going to affect the registration of glyphosate products here in the States? And he said, well, we've looked at the same data that IRAC did, and we don't agree with their conclusion. Now, that was a couple of years ago. And from that, I went ahead and did a little bit of independent research on IRAC, and I found that they have looked at over 900 compounds, and there's only one that has not received at least a probable carcinogen finding, and that's a fiber that's used in the manufacture of yoga pants. So those of you that are wearing yoga pants during this webinar, you're fine. Nothing to worry about. But every single other chemical that they've looked at least got a probable carcinogen. That begins to stretch the bounds of probability. So the other thing that has probably impacted the media, and I actually saw this morning, I saw an ad from a law firm that if you've used glyphosate and you got sick, you need to call this law firm because they're looking for class action lawsuits following the decision of the jury in California lawsuit. The California lawsuit was a gentleman contracted cancer and had used Roundup and claimed that the Roundup is what caused his cancer. The jury agreed, and he was awarded $54 million. Well, that will bring some people out of the woodwork. So I have no idea what evidence was presented to the jury, whether this was a jury nullification activity or whether Monsanto just did a really crappy job of defending themselves. But the science that I have seen and that EPA has seen does not support that finding. Therefore, that's a long answer. The short answer is I have no problems at all using Roundup myself, or I don't recommend pesticide use as part of my job, but I don't have any problem with glyphosate being used as directed, either in terrestrial settings or aquatic settings.
Great, thank you. Certainly a issue we're all following closely right now. Any other questions? And just a reminder, unmute yourself if you'd like to chime in. Okay, great. So I'll go ahead and we'll move along. And as Carlton said, his information is there, so you're welcome to reach out. give me just one moment, and I'm going to give control over to Brian. There you go. And he's going to give us an update on the Apalachicola Regional Stewardship Alliance, CISMA. Thanks, Brian. And Brian, you may need to unmute yourself again.
Okay, can you hear me?
Can hear you now, yes.
Okay,
you may have to click on your screen again.
All right, let's try that.
Sorry.
Okay, good, excellent. All right, I apologize about that. It's a pleasure to be on and giving everyone an update about our little CISMA up here. You can see on the map that we are the Apalachicola Regional Stewardship Alliance CISMA, which is located in the eastern portion of the Panhandle. And we're unique in a couple of ways. I think every CISMA is unique in a couple of ways, but I'll give a little bit of background about us just to give everyone some context. ARSA is a broader alliance for land managers, both public and private, working up in this region. ARSA is a little bit bigger than the CISMA because we actually extend up into Georgia and into one county in Alabama. But since the CISMAs were sort of a Florida concept, the footprint of our CISMA is a little bit smaller and just constrained to the boundaries of the Florida region. And we range, as you can see, from on the east side, that's approximately at the Wasissa River, and on the west side, we stretch out to about the Choctawhatchee River. So it's about 1.5 million acres of conservation land located in there, with some of the big landmarks, including the Apalachicola National Forest, the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, a bunch of state land. I actually work for the Nature Conservancy. We've got one of our flagship preserves out here on the Apalachicola River in Liberty County. And you can see my little Brady Bunch logo thing, so that we've got all of your sort of usual suspects: Water Management District, the feds from the U.S. Forest Service and U.S. Fish, Florida Forest Service, Water Management District, DEP. We also have a couple of private, including us, the Nature Conservancy and Tall Timbers Research Station. So all of us kind of work together under the context of the broader Stewardship Alliance, which has a big focus on prescribed fire and on longleaf pine restoration. But of course, invasive species are a big piece of that. So even though the CISMA existed technically before ARSA did, as soon as ARSA became this sort of broader Stewardship Alliance, we incorporated the CISMA as one of the sort of the working groups or the committees under that broader umbrella of ARSA. So that kind of gives you an idea of, you know, where we place invasive species. I think some of the benefits of that is it has given us a bigger platform to talk about invasive species. You know, when we're having our ARSA meetings, we're talking to fire practitioners, we're talking to restorationists and foresters and all that. So I think we get the invasives message out to a little bit broader of a group than just talking to the people who are sort of boots on the ground spraying weeds. And the advantage there is, like, for instance, on the Apalachicola National Forest, they have a pretty huge fire team, but they also have a huge property, 571,000 acres that they manage. And the folks that are knowledgeable about invasive species are relatively small. So if we can bring that message to the entire fire team when they're out lighting line or scoping out red cockaded woodpecker trees or whatever, they can be that sort of extra set of eyes for us and help us manage from an invasives perspective while they're out there doing their current job. So I think it's been pretty advantageous for us. But you'll see some of the update has a little bit to do with how we fit invasives in with longleaf pine. I'm going to skip this slide because it's not all in there. So for starters, I want to talk about this. Last year in 2017, ARSA completed our 10-year longleaf conservation plan. And of the 5 or 6 kind of major elements, major challenges facing longleaf, invasive species is one of them, and I've got it circled there. This is what's called a situation analysis, where we kind of identify the major threats to our success. And you can see on the far right side of the screen, our success in this case is in this green box that says longleaf pine ecosystem restoration. On that one says private. There's a box right above it that says public, and then the pink box has invasive species kind of pointing to both of them. signifying that it's a significant threat regardless of whether it's on public or private land. And then we identified some of the issues that lead up to invasive species: lack of effective implementation of control, lack of funding, lack of understanding. So there's kind of this sort of gives you the diagram of why it's a problem. And then the next one is called a results chain, which shows sort of our creative thinking on how to address those. So the things in the green or in the yellow boxes are sort of our strategies. And there really are really two major strategies that we focus on from a longleaf perspective up here. And one of them is basically just separating out Kogan grass as our most significant threat to longleaf pine, and then looking at all the other invasive species that sort of do serve a significant threat, but they're not necessarily at the existential level that Kogan grass is. And the reason that we identify Kogan so significantly is because it burns really super hot. It tends to kind of piggyback off of a lot of the land management and restoration efforts that go along with longleaf pine. And in much of the Florida landscape, Kogan grass is just massively out of control. But up here, it's actually, I think, a manageable issue. We've got lots of areas that you'll see in a map in a second where we've got basically Kogan grass free. And so that's sort of a place for us to establish kind of a line in the sand that we know we can work off of and kind of expand and create kind of a big buffer that's Kogan free. So that's kind of where a lot of our CISMA work fits within the broader longleaf work that we do. One of our thoughts actually on that, I'll go back to it, on this results chain, you can see that there's this establish a Kogan grass strike team Georgia model. The idea there is that one of the issues that we've got in Florida, and specifically with Kogan grass, is that there isn't any one entity that's really following and managing our Kogan grass problems as sort of their responsibility. And that's one of the reasons why Kogan grass has become an issue, especially up here, is that a landowner might spray it a couple times, or we might be able to provide assistance as the CISMA a couple times, but nobody's really there giving it that sort of soup to nuts responsibility of surveying, putting it on a map, putting some herbicide on it, coming back a year later to monitor it, maybe spraying it again. I mean, what we know about Kogan grass is you basically can never spray it once and walk away. And in many cases up here, we're finding that we have to spray the same spot many times, 10 times or more, before it's down to either what we would call, extirpated or eradicated, or even if we can call it that, even just down to a manageable level where a landowner could potentially take over. It just needs to go out there with, a couple ounces of herbicide every year to put, just the finishing touches on it. And so what we've decided to do as the Nature Conservancy is to sort of take on that responsibility, following a model that they do up in Georgia, where their state forestry commission does have the permission to follow these Kogan grass locations regardless of whether they're on public or private land, and they're funded to take care of it soup to nuts. So they do have a program that they go out and they survey locations and they identify what needs management, and they go out and they respray and they communicate with the landowners. And in Florida, we don't have a state agency that's got that authority, but the Nature Conservancy does. Since we're a private nonprofit, we can get landowners to sign a liability waiver, and we can go out and spray them. And then similarly, we have agreements and memoranda of understanding with all of the state and federal agencies that allows us to go onto their land and do the similar kind of work. So we can kind of hopefully be that stopgap. We don't really have any funding right now for it, but we are applying for an EPA grant that would theoretically fund this for 3 years and allow us to kind of get it started. And in a second here, I'll show you a map, but we are going to focus on Liberty and Calhoun County, and you'll see this. We do some of the more traditional CISMA activities like National Invasive Species Awareness Week. We do try and do outreach, and we do have 2 pretty significant population centers up here, being in Tallahassee and Panama City, that are good opportunities for us to outreach to landowners, but also, kids. You've got a couple universities here, and there are definitely some young environmentalists and botany club and things like that are interested in invasive species. So that's been a pretty good outlet for us to get some, some numbers in for outreach and kind of help spread the word. So this was a Coral Ardesia event that we did for National Invasive Species Awareness Week last year. We had about 20 people, mostly from FSU, and you can see their shiny, happy faces there. This is something I want to talk about real quick, just because, again, this sort of reiterates this opportunity that we have up here. This is a map I've shown maybe on an update before, so I apologize if it's redundant. But what you can see is a map. The red outline is the boundary of the Apalachicola Regional Stewardship Alliance, the larger LIT. And then the red dots on there are all identified Kogan locations based on EDMAPs. And what's interesting to point out is that if you look at the hash marked location that covers Gadsden, Liberty, Franklin County, if you peer kind of just to the east of that, you can see a whole bunch of Kogan Grass locations. And then what they're butted up against or basically being inhibited by is the Ochlockonee River. And then if you follow that hash mark polygon over, we hit the Apalachicola River, which is that first green line. And then, much further outside of the LIT, the Kogan Grass populations start to pick up. We have some down by Panama City, and then further out west, heading towards Pensacola, there are more. But this hash mark location, half of which is publicly owned. The Apalachicola National Forest is sort of the northern part that's in green, and then Tate's Hell State Forest is the southern part that's in green. Across that entire 35, 40-mile range, there's really only a handful of Kogan Grass locations that are known, and we acknowledge that the data may not be super accurate, but there's definitely a noticeable drop-off, even when you actually drive around these areas, of Kogan Grass ending at the rivers, ending at the constructed concrete bridges that basically cross that river from one county to another, and into a fairly either rural, like Gadsden County is a very rural county, or onto public land. The task here is relatively simple. We've got a handful of locations on private land. We've got a little bit more on public land, but at least we know that the public land managers are doing something about it. They know where those locations are. We know that they're going out and treating it every year. So our plan up here is to basically try and create a Kogan Grass free zone in this 35 to 40-mile range. Part of the idea is that there was some science coming out of UF a year or two ago that suggested that Kogan Grass really had two different genotypes. There was sort of the peninsular Florida genotype and the Alabama genotype. And one of the reasons that Kogan Grass has really low seed viability is that it's not really able to self-pollinate. It needs to cross-pollinate. And since these two genotypes are so large and abundant that any given seed that's floating in the air in peninsular Florida is likely to run into a flower that thinks it's itself, and it won't be able to make a viable seed. Now, when the Alabama population and Florida populations cross, at which at some point they probably will, that seed viability may go up quite a lot, and we're going to try and create this buffer as a way to keep those populations separated. Now, there's some evidence that the ships already sailed on that, and that they're already crossed. Their populations are already overlapping, but we still feel like this is an opportunity for us to just create a big, wide open, lovely, largely publicly owned conservation area that doesn't have a lot of Kogan Grass. And the burden right now is relatively simple. So that's going to be our focus. Last Halloween, we also did an event out at St. Vincent Island National Wildlife Refuge, where we only found one invasive. We found a Chinese tallow tree out in the middle of the island. But it seemed like a good opportunity to get out with some students and do some surveying and talk about island geography and biology and things like that. And it was a nice event. We do have a grant that's actually wrapping up this September from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program, which has a real strong focus on invasives up here. Our local office uses those funds to do river restoration, but they also allocate a certain amount of it, somewhere in the range of $25,000 every year, for us, the Nature Conservancy, to do contracted projects with private landowners in areas that we prioritize. So going back to that map of the Kogan Grass buffer, the handful of Kogan locations that are north of the Apalachicola National Forest and on private land was really kind of the strategic location for us to put these funds. And this project that you can see on this map identifies a couple of those. We've got one large Kogan infestation on private land just north of the National Forest that you can see in the yellow circle kind of in the southeast. And then across the river near the town called Alpha, we found another Kogan Grass location and a bunch of tallow up there. So we were able to use the Fish and Wildlife Service Partners funds to contract with a company to come out and spray those. Now, the area near Bristol, just north of the National Forest, this is now the third time that we've treated that Kogan location. And our hope is that we've knocked it back enough that the landowners can take over, because this partners grant wraps up, like I said, in September. And we will need to reapply for that this upcoming year if we want another go at it. And apparently what we've heard from U.S. Fish, I don't know if there's anybody on the call that can elaborate on this, but the Partners Program apparently has a new system for evaluating their proposals. It used to be largely up to the local office to determine how they wanted to spend that. And now offices apparently are going to be competing against each other for larger buckets of money. It's not getting distributed. It's more like everyone has to submit proposals, and the very best across the whole region are the ones that get funded. So it's less likely that we're going to have money, in the future from this pot than we had in the past. And so we're kind of thinking about this as a wrap up, unless we get fortunate enough to get some additional funds. The other big thing that we really try and push within ARSA, of course, is the FWC invasive plant management section. Because we've got such a huge amount of publicly owned conservation land up here, we really try and encourage our land managers at our ARSA meetings to submit proposals to the working group, the Panhandle working group up here. And I'm the liaison for that. So it's another role that the Conservancy and the CISMA helps to kind of bring the invasive story over to the land management side. And this year was pretty successful. We don't have a super competitive landscape up here as far as getting funding for these different projects. So most of our bigger projects do get funded, and I every year propose one on behalf of the Apalachicola National Forest. That's part of my job, as I partly oversee invasives on the National Forest. But we had a couple other big proposals this year from Water Management District and Blackwater River State Forest, Tyndall Air Force Base, and the city of Tallahassee has been really effective at getting some of their city parks into the IPMS program for some of the smaller projects. But it is another way that we sort of overlap with invasives and land management. Oh, I think that's it. That's me. I mean, that's not me on the picture, but that's it for me.
Great, thanks, Brian. We have 1 or 2 minutes. Does anybody have a quick question? Just a reminder that you are probably muted. I'll give you a second just to check in. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Great update. A lot going on over there. Let me just get there we go. Okay, so just to wrap up today, a few shout outs, and I know that this is not a complete list of everything that the CISMAs have done since our last call, but just a few things that I kind of managed to catch and see that was going on. East Central Florida has updated their EDRR list, so you can check out their website for the updates on that. First Coast Invasive Working Group had a meeting recently, as well as Nature Coast, with a presentation on some cat claw vine research, and that's available. I know they sent that out via email if anyone wants that link to that presentation. And then I have also seen, of course, CISMA participation at the regional air potato beetle workshops that have been going on around the state. There's been a few over the last couple of months where folks can join in, or where folks can come and actually pick up beetles. And so I know recently Six Rivers CISMA participated in one of those workshops. So I know there's so much more going on. So really, this is always a shout out to everybody. Thank you for everything you're doing and everything you continue to do. Just a few quick reminders. For any CISMA leads that are on the call, I sent out a reminder today. We recently sent you guys a couple surveys. One is about the weed wrangle that we talked about on our last call. It's a very quick survey. We're just trying to gauge some potential times of year to hold something like that, which would be a statewide volunteer weed pull kind of event. And then the other is it's a little bit of a longer survey. It's kind of a CISMA operations update. So it's getting some information from you guys on what's going on with your CISMA. And that's really going to help us as FISP moves forward with their strategic plan, give us direction on the needs and what's going on to help support and sustain CISMAs over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. So that one is a little bit longer, but any feedback you provide is greatly appreciated to help us kind of know where we're headed. And then we just got a comment from Ray Vinson. Suncoast CISMA has also updated their EDRR list, and they've got a workshop coming up on October 25th. Thanks, Ray, for giving us that update as well. And then just also for folks, the next 5th steering committee meeting is Thursday, September 6th at the Wakasasa Forestry Center in Gainesville. And I just wanted to add this as well. If there's any new CISMA leads, especially kind of in the time since I came between myself and the former FISP coordinator, Rose, CISMA leads are certainly included and encouraged to be a part of the FISP steering committee meeting. So I think I failed to include you guys in a few meeting notices. So I just want to make sure for CISMA leads that you're aware. And please join us if you're able, and I'll make sure to keep you guys in the loop on those activities. Our call schedule, so as I mentioned before, we are shuffling a little bit. Next month, the current scheduled presentation is risks of only monitoring versus managing noxious cyanobacteria. I am still working on confirming that, only because it was planned so long ago that I'm running into some conflicts with presenters. So I will double check. So just keep your eye out for the call reminder email, which will have the confirmed presentation. But that's what's currently scheduled. And then an update from the First Coast Invasive Species Working Group, which is confirmed for the next call. And then the following month, we are going to have, we just switched this up. Actually, Carlton today was kind enough. He was actually originally scheduled for October. He was kind enough to switch to being on the call today so that we could accommodate FNA's schedule for them to present a presentation on their role with FISP and CISMA. So how FNA can be supportive of and what they do that relates to FISP and CISMA. So really looking forward to that presentation. And then we'll have a CISMA update from Heartland CISMA. And then again, also I am working on our next schedule of calls for January through May 2019. So if you have any ideas, we've got some stuff in the queue. But if there's anything you see or anything you'd really like to see covered, please always feel free to send me information on that and we can look into it. And with that, I think we are right on time. So I'm just going to skip over that and say thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Carlton, for your presentation, and Brian for your update with the Apalachicola CISMA. And then just a reminder, we're here every 4th Wednesday of the month at 1:30, except for November and December. And past calls are always available online at the link provided there. And it usually takes a week or so to ensure that the most recent call is up. So you can check back in a week or so, and this call from today should be there. So thanks again, everybody, and look forward to talking to you again next month.